Dharman is doing, if not the impossible, then at least the improbable, things that a lot of creators would tell you just can't be done. Not only is he operating at an unfathomable scale, but he's doing it with scripted narrative content in a world that's often dominated by very factual or very present storytelling. Sean Atkins has ridden this whole media cycle from the very beginnings with traditional media companies through the first parts of the digital revolution and now fully into the creator space. And I'm Rene Ritchie. I've been a creator on YouTube since 2008, and I have the absolute pleasure of bringing all of us together to talk about all of this. How are you? Thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks. And that was off the cuff, right? Because Sean was a last minute decision to add, so that was really great.
I try. It's like my one skill is an intro. So I
that
figured
was
I
awesome.
Like a lot of people would tell you that you just can't make scripted content work at YouTube, and certainly not at the scale of which we're going to get into, like full-fledged studio. How?
Well, to answer that question, I guess I got to start back at the basics. Is when I was beginning as a creator 7 years ago, I never intended to create a massive studio. I didn't come from a film background. I never even took a film class before. I was simply driven by my mission, which was to help people overcome hard times that they were going through, the same kind of hard times that I had been through in my life. And just like any entrepreneur, any creator, you have to constantly iterate as to what's working and what's not. So the early days started with me just talking to camera, trying to give life advice, and I couldn't get a single video to break 1,000 views. And I realized that I have to keep pivoting and trying different things. And then one day, I was writing a script on a napkin, because that's how I used to write things. And I was writing a story about everything teaches a life lesson, right? So I was writing a story about how cheating in relationships can start with relatively small, innocent acts, such as like liking someone's post on Facebook or something. And as I'm writing this story of a guy who is liking his ex-girlfriend's post on Facebook while his wife is cooking him dinner, right, behind her back. And I happen to look over, and my brother-in-law was on his phone on Facebook, ironically, and one of my wife's friends was cooking something in the kitchen with her back towards him. And I was like, oh my gosh, what if the visual of what I'm seeing is actually corresponding to what I'm writing? So I walked up to my brother-in-law and my wife's friend, and I was like, hey, would you guys mind being in a video? And I told my cameraman, I was like, hey, can you just record this, please? And so they asked me, like, what do we need to do? I was like, nothing, just say exactly where you are. And I narrated this whole speech about, why you should be faithful in your relationship. And they were background actors. So the funny part about this is my first actor was my brother-in-law. We shot everything on an iPhone. My set was my apartment that we were staying in. We had no resources, no crew. We had no idea what we were doing. And that was the magic in it, right? Like a lot of people could see that as a disadvantage, but there was actually a great advantage because not knowing turned out to be the biggest blessing. I didn't go into this thinking I have to do everything the same way that traditional production companies do things, because then I would have had to start with a 100-person crew and all my money I would have spent on trying. Exactly. All my money budget would have been spent on one video. And then if that didn't work, which it never does, I'd have been like, great, that was my life savings gone, right? I approached it with like, we have no money, no experience, no equipment, nothing. We just have to makeshift everything. And that strategy ended up working. We built a very engaged community. And, as time went on, now we're approaching our 7th year. Now we used to put out 3 to 4 minute videos one time a week. Now we put out about 3 to 4 hours of premium scripted content every single week. We've been able to build a pretty massive following of about 130 million subs and followers across all platforms. And we're averaging about over 1 billion long form views a month with a primarily English speaking audience. So you're right. A lot of people thought that you can't create scripted and make it work. But the reason that it works for us is because we do things at 1/100th the cost of traditional media players, and we move very fast, and we're very engaged in what our audience wants. We're constantly looking at comments and iterating and analyzing things. So it's been a very fun journey, but I think our journey goes to show it truly is the tipping point in which, YouTube is becoming the new TV, and creators are trying to create TV-like content for YouTube.
I love this. I love this so much. Like, it does sound incredible, but at the same time, it makes so much sense because all these formats have existed for a long time. It's like the digital and delivery method, like live streams and podcasts are like drive time radio.
That's right.
And then you have like regular videos, which could be anything from a music video to a TV show, and shorts are like after school, like The More You Know or Heritage Moment or something. And I mean this as the highest form of compliment, so I hope it sounds that way. There was no analog for Saturday morning TV or after school specials, but like, why wouldn't that exist in a digital world?
That's right. It's like, I think one of the things that people forget is that there are universal stories, right? And so regardless of the platform, we're looking at filmmaking, you're looking at television, you're looking at plays, they all go to universal human truth and universal storytelling. And that's ultimately what entertainment is exposing that in some way, whether it be an entertainment version that brings me some value or a knowledge version. And so if you really look at a lot of the digital creators who've come up, they stand on the shoulders of other people in other mediums who've done it, right? I tell people, it was like, I got to thank the Greeks for writing plays, right, at the end of the day. Whereas, the example I use all the time is like Jimmy has done, for example, an incredible thing. But if you really trace his breakthrough, the format would be called Queen for a Day, which was built in like 1940 on television, right? So he just revolutionized that format that people like to watch people having their dream come true, right? That's a known format. Or Eric, for example, he basically started doing like every MTV 90s format, but in one day, right? So Next was like one episode, right? Or Fear Factor was one episode. So the genius of these creators is not only understanding what their audience wants, but also thinking in a format way, because what is true in content is what is old is new, is what's new is old. It always is, and I think that's the great thing. I think on the scripted side, what's exciting about it is if you look across most media, plays, film, television, books, it's actually fiction and narrative that drives most of the revenue, and it drives most of the cultural impact, right? For good or for bad, like we don't talk about the great documentary we watched that often, where I say the word like Harry Potter, or I say Star Trek, we all go, oh my God, I want to talk about that. And so the thing is, what is true in the not digital world always becomes true in the digital world. So it's fascinating. A scripted will happen, but it requires an entrepreneur like Dhar, like what Alan Chicken Chow is doing, who are figuring out how to make the same value of scripted, but under the restrictions that you can't spend anywhere near or use the traditional infrastructure. Otherwise, the economics just don't work.
And you look at Harry Potter, and then you go back to Tolkien, and then you go back to Beowulf, and then you go back to the stories we all told. But there's like a lineage of we were talking about Star Wars before, and you can go to Kurosawa and World War II movies and see shot for shot. But so a lot of creators, when they first begin to start growing, one of the biggest questions they have is, how do I hire? Who do I hire? For some, it's an editor so they can start making more videos. For some, it's an agent so they can make more money. For some, it's a COO so that they can tell them who to hire. What is your advice for people who are just at the cusp of next level?
You have to start scrappy, right? For us, like we've bootstrapped our way all the way through. I have, so many people think that, oh man, because Darman is at this level or Mr. Beast is at this level, I need to go out and raise a whole bunch of money and start a studio. That's the same mistakes that, a lot of founders who have failed have made, where you try to take on a bunch of capital without really developing any sort of product market fit or developing an audience or a community that cares. Again, going back to my origin story, if I had started with a big budget, I probably would have failed because I needed things to be so scrappy where it gave me a long runway to experiment and figure out what works. So I would say, your first few hires are very much the most important. You have to kind of find somebody that complements the skills that you have. So if I'm a great writer, I need an amazing director, I need an amazing editor, I need an amazing producer. For me personally, I found that all in one person. So, your first few hires, they have to be people that are as excited about the vision and mission as you are, because these are the people that are going to be burning the midnight oil with you. We've believed in sort of a farm type workforce where we hire people that can sort of punch but higher than their weight class, and they're willing to work very hard, and we try to promote within. And even a lot of our head of production was somebody who was the very first person that started with me, who just transitioned to showrunner. So when you're starting out, treat it like a family. That's how I see it. Your first 5 to 10 people are going to be people that are generalists. They're working on a little bit of all kinds of different tasks. Once you get past 10 family members or so, I would say that's when you kind of get into a town or village style management structure. And this is where you want to hire more specialists. So instead of hiring someone that's going to produce, direct, and shoot, well, now you've got someone who is not only one person that's editing, but then you've got maybe one person who is working on just sound and one person who's working on just color, because now they're trying to take those details to the next level. After you expand to about past 25 people or so, that's when I'd say you're starting to get into the city type management structure. And that's where you need some mid-level management, because if you're the person that every single person is coming to with their problem, you're not going to be able to focus on what you do very well. And then it wasn't until we crossed about 100 people or so that we actually started building out our executive team. And so now, we have Sean, who is a very experienced industry exec who's come on as our CEO, but he's brought a handful of very seasoned people with him that have helped take us to the next level. And it was funny, as we were walking into Google today, we were having an executive lunch meeting, and I was like, great, we're gonna meet the 4 or 5 execs, and then there's like 100 people in the room. So I was like, Sean, how many execs does Google have? And he's like, I don't know, probably thousands.
All of them? Yeah, all the execs.
So then you go into a country, then you go into, right, like a whole globe. So every level has its different stages of growth. But I would say in the beginning, you don't need to have a big team. You don't need to have top quality equipment and, expensive locations and studios. Like, be as scrappy as long as you possibly can. And funny enough, even though now like our organization has grown quite a bit, we're spending a lot of time talking about the magic that we had when things first started and we were 2 or 3 person crews. And we're actually starting a new format division where it is just 2 or 3 people that are highly creative in figuring out how to create videos on their own. So I would say, that scrappy bootstrap mindset is the biggest skill set that you have, and choose those initial people very carefully, because ultimately they're the ones that are going to enable you to scale.
I think my experience, having coached a few creators and gone through this journey myself, is I always tell them, like, this is a bit of a complicated question, because it actually starts with almost more of a spiritual question, right? Like, do you know what you're super passionate about? Do you know the superpower that gets you out of bed? And are you willing to let go of the other things? Because the biggest challenge, and by the way, this is not a creator problem, it's an entrepreneur problem, right? There's a great book I always recommend that creators read called The E-Myth. It's like called The E-Myth Revisited. It's about how entrepreneurs trying to get to the next stage Dhar explored. And the first issue for all of them is to admit that, yes, you're probably the best at everything. That's what got you here. But to get to the next level, you have to be willing to psychologically to the point where, like, I'm going to say that Dhar is going to do this better than me. And it's really hard as an entrepreneur, and I would argue doubly hard when you're the creative. It was the same experience I went through. And so the first thing is you have to sort of understand, like for Dhar, he was more passionate in writing than he was, say, passionate about doing the logistics of production. So he hired, to his point, that skill set. So the first step is really, are you ready? Because I've met a lot of creators who think they're ready, then they bring in somebody, and then they either check out and they do everything, which is bad, or they don't actually let them do anything. They just have a head count that they're micromanaging. So you're just trying to find the balance between those two.
What's funny is, so a few years ago, I got really sick. And it turned out to be the biggest blessing in disguise. So I was not sleeping. I was working insane hours, just like a lot of creators or a lot of entrepreneurs. So I was literally like in bed drinking coffee and sipping energy drinks to try to stay up so I can get another script out or finish this edit. And I was taking on every role. And as Sean's talking about, I would hire people that are willing to take on the task, but like the creative just couldn't let go of that control. And it wasn't until I got sick and a doctor told me, like, you have to focus on your health and sleep and work-life balance, because you're not going to be able to last if you continue down this road. I had to let go, right? Because I was medically forced to. And that ended up being the biggest blessing in disguise, because as soon as I stepped out, that encouraged everyone else to rise up and really spread their wings and show their capabilities. It's not going to happen overnight. It's not like we started having hits, as soon as everyone else took over. But now I had to focus on sort of training the next generation versus trying to do everything myself. And we're trying to create, a generational company, right? Like Walt Disney, passed away a long time ago, but Disney still continues to exist, just like, Steve Jobs is gone, but Apple is reaching new heights. And I think a lot of creators want to create these legacy media brands. So in order to do that, you do constantly have to figure out how to put yourself out of a job and how to have someone else take over those responsibilities, which is what we try to do every day.
That's interesting too, and I'd love your take on this because you've worked from the HBOs, the Revision 3s, and now Dhar Studios. Is like the Colin and Samir model is that traditional studio, you have like the CEO and then everything floods down. Like you can change directors, actors, all of these things, and like the company will just run. But in a creator business, it's the opposite. Like you have like everything on your shoulders as the creator, and that means like you're stressing about everybody's job and you're doing everything because you feel like if you let go for a second, like running downhill. If you take one misstep, it's how do you deal with creators when they are both like in front of the camera and trying to run the business?
So I actually use a couple examples, and I'll use one today. And so I'll typically sit to a creator who has this mindset, which by the way, again, I always tell them like, I had this mindset, I've been in your chair, I'm highly empathetic to this conversation. I said, have you ever heard of a gentleman named Steven Spielberg? They're like, yeah, I've heard of Steven Spielberg. I'm like, think he's talented? Think he's done anything worth value? He's like, yeah, of course, I've started Steven Spielberg. I was like, do you know he's never written a film, right? They're like, what? I'm like, he's never DP'd the camera. I'm like, he's never edited. It's like, what? Like, he's also never written the music. And you just keep going, right? And I go, do you still think he's talented? Yeah. Do you still think he's a visionary who's the auteur of his films? Like, yes. I said, so a creator scaling is not a new problem. Like it has been around since I'm sure the first caveman was like, I would like to put handprints on a second cave, right? And so what it is that's why I said it, really knowing what superpower. So Steven's superpower is really knowing what the right story is for the archetypes he likes to work in, and then how does he build a team? There's a reason his teams are consistent. How do I build a team who knows how to take that vision and execute, right? I can make an example not from the fiction side, from the nonfiction side. Ever heard of someone called Oprah Winfrey?
Yeah.
Do you think she chose the chairs on her set? No. She thinks she chose the director? No. Do you think she wrote the opens? No. Right? But there's a crew of people that came up to Dhar's point with her. So typically what you see for creators, whether it's in the traditional or non-traditional world, is they find their Rubens, like who's was the first hire that Dhar had, an unbelievable talent and a true believer. And when you meet him, he exudes the mission of the company, right? But the reason he's in the chairs he's gotten to is because he's worked his way and sort of learned Dhar's brain, right? And so part of what it is like whether you're a Shonda Rhimes or you're Jimmy or you're Colin and Samir, where you are in your cycle is depending on where you are, it's having people come on that journey and learn your vision and learn your creative and then giving them enough room that I can execute on your vision, although I won't make exactly the same thing as you. And that's the thing, even in my creative junior, I had to tell people, it's like, when I ran a studio, I was the executive producer. I did everything. And my identity was identified with like, they bought me, I make the show, right? And I remember one point, to Dhar's point, I had enough capacity. My doctor's like, you can't. And that year I had 9 showrunners who did all the shows. And at the end of that year, my hit rate was the same, right? All the things were the same except for one critical thing. The creative, when you looked at the reel, was the most interesting, diverse level of creative because I just let the tie go to the other creative every time. And I tell you, it was like, which was another painful learning because my identity told me that I am all of it. And then first I had to let go, which is painful. And the second lesson was I was just as successful in partnering with another creator who was part of my DNA than it had to be me. And that's the journey you have to go on as a creative. Not all can do it. Not all want to do it. There's no rhyme or reason that you have to or don't. But that's generally the journey if you want to do it.
Well, if you want to get to this scale, though, can we talk a little bit about the scale? Because I think when people hear like a 100-person team, Burbank studio, multiple sounds, how big have you gotten at this point?
You want to take that one?
The physical plant is about over 100,000 square feet. It's 3 sound stages in our actual area, and then we have another offsite location that we use that has multiple buildings on it. We have about, in production, it's a little different, right? Because you've got freelance staff and whatnot, but we probably run somewhere around 150 to 200 people on a freelance basis coming through the company. And then on the acting side, probably about 1,500 actors come through on a basis. And so, again, the thing is that when you look at the creator space, that sounds immense, and it is from an operational though, but it's also super efficient, right? Yeah. So to Dhar's point, like you got to get specialists, but our version of specialists is instead of someone who can do anything, they now can only do 20, right? Because the analogy I give people from the linear world, I said there was a day when you wanted to do a feature film, you need like 1,000 people.
Yeah.
You want to do a broadcast TV show, you need like 200 people. You want to do a cable show, you get 20, right? Digital, you get 2. Right, so it's an exponential curve, and so what happened each one of those times, you had a specialization. So when I grew up in the reality business, you were a producer in television, basically scripted, you were just a writer. Not just a writer, demeaning, but like that was your job. When you're a producer in like unscripted, you were the field producer, the writer, you did the post notes, so you had like 5 jobs. And so now, like when you get into digital, like when you're a director, let's say, the director's also kind of doing some AD work and prep work and pre-visualization, and they're giving comments on the edit team, and they're managing. Like it's a much more richer but broader thing than the sort of narrowness that happens in order for to work at the economics that constrain the business.
Yeah, just to give you some sense of scale, like last month we did about 1.4 billion long form views. So I don't know, that breaks down to about like 40 million views a day or so. If you just look at YouTube and US viewership, we're at about like 5.5 to 6 million views a day. And if you compare that to the top 10 TV shows in the world, we would be number 1 on any given day. But to certain traditional folks, they don't see us as, a media brand or a studio, right? Like, I think we're making some progress. Golden Globes is now honoring podcasters. I think Emmys hopefully is going to start taking on some creators. So it's like we're creating the same quality of content. We're using like the same type of gear and cameras and everything. We're employing lots of folks, right? Whereas the traditional industry has actually become a very hard place to find consistent work. Yet we're not treated as, media players in the traditional sense. So I think that tide is shifting, like you said, yet being the key word. But yeah, we're having a lot of fun. And then we also have an agency actually where we help other creators. One of my passion projects is, YouTube has been around for 20 years now. Yeah. Happy birthday, YouTube. That's a big deal. And so the folks that started early on, maybe some folks started making content in their late teenage years or early 20s. Well, now they're in their 30s and 40s, right? And they're starting families, they're buying houses, they're getting married. They're starting to think of things outside of YouTube, and they don't have as much free time as they used to because of all these responsibilities. So but they're so attached to their community, their audience, their channel. So how do creators exit? Or how do they have, more income that doesn't directly rely on them doing more work? So that's what our 5th quarter agency does. We've become the best in the business. Sean came from running Jelly Smack, who was like, the gold standard for helping syndicate content across different platforms. And now we're doing that in-house. We work with some of the top YouTubers, Jordan Matter, Stokes Twins, Rebecca Zamolo, Zach King. We're helping other creators earn 7 figures a year in passive income. And then now we're also in the process of raising our very first fund where we can acquire creators and actually give them exit opportunities that allows them to still creatively stay involved. So they can get that lump sum to be able to go buy their house and send their kids through college and take care of all their life stuff, but they're still very much involved in the creative. And they're also partnering with other folks that understand digital, that understand YouTube and how to build audiences. So we're actually very passionate about helping to create scale for other creators and even exit opportunities.
I think one of the things that the traditional side discounts, which I love. I tell people it's like the best thing when you're, and look, this is my career, right? I started in cable when all my classmates went into feature films because cable was for losers, right? I went into reality TV before the name had a name. I went into podcasting. So I'm sort of used to the more people like dismiss it, the more I'm like, everybody should run over there. I think the great thing about digital creators is that most digital creators who are passionate about their audience are not waking up every morning and be like, how do I make a feature film? They're waking up every morning like, how do I make more great content for this audience? And so, when I first got to Dhar, because of my background, right, you can imagine people like, when are we going to do a TV show or a feature film or whatever? And I said, somewhat facetiously to them, I said, you want to know the amount of time I think about selling a TV show? 0. Because we have such a passionate audience and we have such an ability, and that's what's wonderful about being on YouTube, is you have the ability to tap into that audience, satisfy their need, grow with them, and continue to feed them in a direct manner. And having someone who's done hundreds of hours in the linear side, like, you just don't get that, right? It's like some gatekeeper could be used, like, I like your thing, I don't like your thing.
Yeah.
And you're like, I don't know if that's real. I tell people often that when they ask, like, what's the show you're most proud of? I typically mention something that got canceled. Like, it was my favorite piece of content I made, but I don't really feel much more in that because I had no idea if it had the right shot or not, because the person who bought it like didn't like it, so they buried it in a certain perspective. And so where YouTube allows creators to do it on their own, and that's why I think when we talk about YouTube's like 40th, there won't be a conversation like, it'll be more like YouTube has taken over the world and creators have all these huge scale direct relationships, and that's sort of where it's going to go.
Yeah, I think the creators are the next generation studios is something we say a lot, but the next generation is eventually like this generation. And what it sounds like from talking to you is it's not just the next generation studios, but you're encapsulating the process from end to end in a way that was just simply never possible with previous studios, and giving the creative talent the agency not just to like be a director or but to actually like own the IP, to own their dream, their vision, and to realize it from the very, very beginning all the way through to, on a boat sipping a martini on the beach earning 20%. Like it's a much more ambitious, like it's much more efficient, but it's much more ambitious than it was before.
Absolutely.
When you're looking forward into like the next year, the next couple of years, the next 5 years, for YouTube in general, but also for creators and studios, what's the vision? How do you see it progressing?
I guess so. Look, I think the fact that regardless of whether you're talking digital video or music or whatever, that creatives have the tools to go direct is never going to slow down the amount of people trying. It's never going to slow down consumption. I tell people there's only 2 industries that basically have infinite demand, and it is the generation of content and it is the generation of energy, right? And so those 2 industries are only going to be like, because you can niche down forever, right? And so that will continue to be so. And so I think you'll just see, as long as the monetization systems there, just a unbelievable renaissance of talent coming through the different platforms making content. I think the next thing is, like, as you're starting to see now, the ones who sort of built these businesses, once you get to a certain scale, you're kind of a creator is a creative and a network in one. And so you'll see the continuing of this evolution of businesses as creator. That might be a content business, it might be an events business that Colin and Samir were talking about. They might want to make it big, they might want to keep it small. I think all of those variables become true. And what I'm excited about is, like, in the traditional world, the sort of equity incentive disappeared, right? By law, it actually used to exist, and by law it got taken away. And so in the digital platforms, if you're an entrepreneur and you want to take the risk, you can get there, right? To Dara's point, it's like, he's taken tremendous personal risk along the journey to get to where else. Where people walk in like, oh my God, I can build a studio. I'm like, well, that's now tens of millions of dollars of investment, and thousands of hours and physical injury. And so there still is a limit. Like, not everybody's willing to do that. And so I think that's what's going to happen. And I think you're going to see what happens in every creative business, where you'll get to a certain scale and then creators will start coming together or aggregating. Because, like, if you look at a Disney or Universal Music, or in the video game business, they're all aggregations of talent that have come together to get greater scale. And that's ultimately what we think is going to happen, is that, you'll have creators get to like a point where they want to exit, they want to come together, they want to do something bigger, and they'll join forces and scale up from there.
And then stay passionate.
This whole company, now it's a company, right? Like, because I still just see it as a mission. It started with trying to help someone go through a hard time. And so that is like the number one factor that we look for, even when hiring, when storytelling, when deciding what new business venture to pursue. We had a very lucrative opportunity to partner with a snack brand, and it would have been a huge windfall for us, but at the end of the day, we just didn't feel like it aligned with our true mission. So the mission always comes first. We started creating content. When I put out my very first video, I was hesitant at first because I was like, oh, the same types of hesitations that a lot of creators have, right? Like, is anyone gonna watch my content? Are people gonna make fun of it? What are friends and family gonna think? Like, right, what if it doesn't work out? What got me through that hump to publish my first video was I thought, you know what, even if one person watches my video and because of that video, they have a better day and they were able to get through a tough time, that makes the journey worthwhile. And even now, 7 years in, 200 employees, billions of views, 100+ million followers, that is still our compass. We are still trying to create content for that person that is going through a hard time, and we're never going to lose that mission. So yeah, mission always comes first, and it's always about, trying to help that one person have a better day. So yeah.
I love it. Thank you both so much for joining me. This has been absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun.
Appreciate you.
Thanks for having us. Really appreciate it. Thank you.